A meaningful percentage of quality misses are not missing care. The member got the care, the physician documented it, the chart was retrieved, the evidence existed, and the measures stayed open anyway. Why? Because abstraction failed. And that may be one of the least measured but most financially consequential problems in the quality operations today. Let's get into it. Over the last few episodes, we've talked about chart retrieval, digital feeds, and reconciliation between manual and digital feeds. Those are the upstream systems responsible for getting quality data into the pipeline. Today, I want to talk about the last mile, the point where a human being reviews the clinical documentation and decides whether a quality measure closes or decides whether to accept the evidence in the documentation. That step is abstraction. And most organizations spend enormous efforts improving chart retrieval rates, feed completeness, chart acquisition, provider outreach, member outreach, while spending far less efforts measuring whether the abstraction decision itself was actually correct. That gap has consequences across HEDIS, Medicare stars, Medicaid quality programs, behavioral health, reporting environments, and essentially every hybrid quality workflow operating today. Because abstraction is where the entire pipeline becomes a final operational judgment call. And most plans have limited instrumentation around that. Now, let me ask you a direct question. Could you tell me your abstraction accuracy rate by abstractor, by measure, by data source, by season, whether prospective season or retrospective season? And I'm not talking about your retrieval completion rate, not your overall quality score, not your submission rate. I mean, what percentage of abstraction decisions were actually correct against the current year's specification on the first pass? If you can answer that question clearly, you are operating at a much more mature level than most organizations. And you should probably have a podcast of your own. But most plans cannot answer it comprehensively. And it's not because they lack QA programs. They have inter-rater reliability audits, secondary review, coder calibrations, and overread workflows. Those are real quality controls, but most plans still do not measure abstraction accuracy comprehensively at the actual decision layer. And this distinction matters. Now, before someone says their vendor already reports sub 1% error rate, now let me unpack what that measures and what it doesn't. Most vendor QA programs primarily measures consistency. Coder A or abstractor A reviews the chart. Reviewer B validates it, and both agree. That is useful, but the agreement does not automatically equal correctness against the specification itself. Two people can agree on the wrong interpretation of a look-back window, a qualifying language, a procedures classification, or an annual specification update. When that happens, the error passes internal QA perfectly. The overread validates it. The IRR audit confirms it, and the error still reaches submission. This is not a vendor failure. It is a structural limitation of processes designed to validate internal consistency more than external accuracy against evolving measure logic. Now, AI has changed the game, as we all know, but partially. Modern clinical NLP is genuinely capable. AI-assisted abstraction systems can surface evidence, identify likely numerator events, process charts at scale, and dramatically improve retrieval efficiency. This is real progress, but hybrid abstraction remains the operational standard across the industry. The AI identifies, the human adjudicates, and the three failure points still remain inside that human decision layer. First, there is complex multi-source reasoning. The evidence may exist across specialist notes, lab sections, encounter history, and enrollment context. Integrating all of that into a final measure determination is still difficult to automate reliably. The second reason is specification tag. NCQA updates specification every year. Models are trained on prior logic. There is always operational lag between the specification updates and the model retraining. And the third reason is important. Most organizations measure extraction accuracy far more than education accuracy. Those are not the same. Finding evidence and correctly determining whether it satisfies the measure are fundamentally different operational tasks. Let me make this concrete. So a member completes a colonoscopy with a GI specialist, right? The chart gets retrieved successfully. CCD feed arrives. So reconciliation between the manual chart retrieval and the CCD data happens. The evidence exists in the record, right? But the abstractor reviews the primary care documentation first and does not clearly identify the completed procedure, and the gap still remains open as a result. Now, what happens? The member gets added to the next year's outreach campaign. Another retrieval gets ordered. Another chart gets chased. Another provider gets contacted, even though the measure was technically already satisfied. This is not a retrieval failure because the chart existed. It is not a feed failure because the data arrived. It is also not a reconciliation failure because the records matched both digital and the manual chart. That is an abstraction failure creating downstream operational waste. And most systems do not explicitly flag it as an abstraction failure. It simply appears as another unresolved gap. So where does abstraction actually break operationally? Most failures fall into 7 categories, and I'm going to break them down. The number one failure is clinical interpretation error. In this case, the evidence exists. The evidence has been retrieved, but the abstractor draws the wrong conclusion. For instance, diagnostic versus screening procedures, referral language versus completed care, incomplete versus completed services, or qualifying language changing the interpretation, or if a physician note, provider notes that says, rule out malignancy, colonoscopy recommended. It is not an evidence that the screening actually occurred. Providers document for clinical care. Abstractors interpret for quality compliance logic. Those are different objectives. The number two reason is measure specification misapplication. The abstractor has the evidence but applies the wrong rule. And this becomes particularly dangerous with look back windows. Under COLE measure specification, colonoscopy has 9-year window. CT colonography has 4-year window, right? Stool DNA with FIT is 2-year window. IFOBT is annually. Misclassifying a CT colonography as optical colonoscopy is not a cosmetic coding issue. It materially changes whether the member qualifies. And because specification updates annually, prior year muscle memory creates a systemic error surprisingly often. The third reason is data mapping errors. So in this case, the clinical fact is actually there, but the structured output becomes wrong. For instance, screening procedures coded as diagnostic or incorrect CPT or value set mapping, service date confused with the results date. The evidence is there, right? But operationally, it becomes unusable. The fourth reason is source prioritization failures. And I covered this in episode 4 and episode 5. This is where you have multiple sources for the same member. The abstractor may end up working from the wrong source. For instance, an outdated records overriding newer documentation, or claims record overriding the specialist documentation, duplicate records creating conflicting interpretation. And without a consistently enforced source hierarchy, abstractors gradually develop different judgment logic. From the outside, it looks like it's standardized, but operationally, it's not. The fifth category for abstraction failure is timing and measurement window errors. You have correct event, wrong time frame. The service occurred outside the qualifying period. The wrong date was interpreted, or a preventive service became confused with diagnostic follow-up. The sixth reason is cognitive load omission, and this is the silent failure. The evidence is there. The abstractor simply does not see it. And it's not because they made a wrong decision, because they missed it entirely. Could be due to high chart volumes, fatigue, ambiguous documentation, Q4 production pressure. The chart appears reviewed. The evidence disappears operationally, and the member returns next year for the reason no report fully explains. The seventh reason for abstraction failure is incentive-driven drift. In this case, the abstractors optimize around what gets measured. So if throughput is rewarded, then speed wins over accuracy. If closure rate is emphasized, then marginal evidence starts looking sufficient. The same way, if audit avoidance dominates culturally, then valid closures may get missed conservatively. This is not an individual problem. It is a production system problem. And unlike the random error, systemic directional bias compounds year over year. Underneath those seven failure modes are three root causes. The root cause number one is interpretation variance. Human judgment is inherently variable. Different abstractors reviewing the same charts may reach different conclusions depending on their level of training, their level of experience, fatigue, workflow design, workload, and documentation ambiguity or stress, right? Most organizations measure throughput. Far fewer measure interpretation accuracy against actual specification logic. The number two root cause is specification complexity. Quality specifications are operationally difficult. You have different procedure rules, different look back windows, annual updates, value sets, enrollment logic, exclusions. The complexity itself is unavoidable, as you know, but most organizations train specifications seasonally without operationally enforcing them during abstraction itself. And that creates drift. And that drift often remains invisible until the final reporting. The third root cause is unmeasured adjudication accuracy. This is the most consequential issue. AI has shifted the abstractor's role from primary chart reader to final decision maker in some cases. That is a major operational improvement, but the final adjudication call is still human. Does this evidence, in full context, against this year's specification actually satisfy the measure? That judgment layer remains variable, and most organizations still do not measure it directly. The difference between a guardrail and a crash investigation is usually timing. In abstraction operations, that timing gap can cost an entire reporting season. Now, let's shift to a different aspect of this topic where this becomes financial, right? In real production environments, once you account for interpretation variance, specification drift, omission errors, seasonal pressure, actual abstraction variance is often materially higher than internal QA disagreement rates suggests. Let's use a conservative illustration. A plan has 10,000 members on a hybrid measure, and 5% of open gaps actually remain valid evidence that was missed or misclassified operationally. That equals 500 members. 500 members where the cur occurred. The evidence existed. The chart was retrieved. The measure still failed to close. At that point, abstraction accuracy stops being only an operational metrics, particularly on heavily weighted measures like GSD or BPCE, formerly blood pressure, um, breast cancer screening, medication adherence programs, and other performance sensitive measures. And here's the deeper issue. Organizations will spend millions improving retrieval rates while having limited instrumentation around the step determining whether retrieved evidence actually becomes quality credits. Healthcare has built enormous infrastructure around collecting data that it still struggles to interpret consistently. That imbalance is one of the largest operational blind spots in payer quality today. So, what do mature organizations do differently? Right? Let's look on the flip side. Usually, four things. And the first thing they do is they track abstraction accuracy directly, not just chart completion counts. It's actual detection accuracy by abstractor, by measure, by source, whether chart retrieval, whether digital feeds, and longitudinally over time. The second thing that they also do is they embed workflow enforcement into abstraction itself. So if an abstractor enters a procedure outside the allowable window, the system flags it immediately. The third thing that mature organizations or mature systems do, they operationalize specification updates before production begins. What does it mean? Historical charts get tested against updated logic before the season kicks off. So training focuses specifically on where prior year logic is now incorrect. The fourth step or the fourth thing they do is also they treat Q4 degradation as a predictable operational risk. You have higher chart volume, more fatigue, shorter review cycles, more complex charts. Sophisticated organizations staff and QA accordingly instead of assuming abstraction quality remains static all year because the downstream cost of abstraction failure is identical regardless of when it happens. The measure still stays open. So here's the question to take back to your team. You know your retrieval rate, you know your ingestion success rate, but do you know your abstraction accuracy rate by abstractor, by measure, by source, and by season? Because if the answer is no, then that is your biggest data quality problem. The most expensive chart in healthcare may be the chart you already retrieved correctly and it still failed to close. Now, how does Podero approaches this? Podero approaches abstraction as an operational intelligence layer, combining retrieval context, workflow enforcement, evidence validation, and abstraction visibility into one operational system, not as a judgment on your team or your vendor, as a visibility into where performance leakage is actually happening before more money gets spent chasing the wrong problem. The link is in the show notes. I will see you in the next episode.